Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Beth Wadham from the Association for Contemplative Mind in Higher Education, and welcome to our March webinar, The Blue Pearl, a research report on teaching mindfulness practices to college students, with Deborah J. Haynes, who is Professor of Art and Art History at the University of Colorado-Boulder. Before coming to University of Colorado-Boulder, she was Director of Women's Studies at Washington State University in Pullman, Washington. Deborah has an MFA from the University of Oregon and earned her PhD from Harvard University. She's the author of 2 books published by Cambridge University Press. One is Bakhtin and the Visual Arts, the other Vocation of the Artist, and also Art Lessons, Meditations on the Creative Life. Deborah also edited Opening Our Moral Eye, published by Lindisfarne, and that's a book of M.C. Richards' last talks and essays. She was consulting editor for The Subjective Eye and has published numerous articles and reviews in the last 17 years. Her latest book, Book of This, in parentheses, Place, Spirituality, Art, and the Land, reflects an integration of her scholarly and creative work and includes drawing and writing in marble. Oh, not the book, but her creative work includes drawing and writing in marble. Deborah has practiced yoga for more than 30 years and has experience in Zen, Vipassana, and Tibetan Buddhist meditation traditions. After helping to care for several friends at the end of their lives, during 2007 and 2008, she completed training to serve as a hospice volunteer. She originally had planned to present the research that she'll share with us today at the 2012 Association for Contemplative Mind in Higher Education Conference, which was last fall, but as she was unable to attend, we've been anticipating it for some time. So we're very much looking forward to learning more. And thanks for offering to share this with us, Deborah. And now I'll hand over the presentation to you.
Thank you very much, Beth. And I would also like to thank all of you for joining the webinar today and to express my gratitude to 2 institutions, the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society, which encouraged me on this path from 2002 when I became a fellow, and to the President's Teaching and Learning Collaborative and Director Marianne Shea at the University of Colorado, which has supported my research since 2008. Well, I think probably most of you have seen this abstract. It's just a very brief summary of what I'm going to do today, talk about today. But I would amend it simply by saying that I conducted human subject research with 2 smallish classes of undergraduate students. But I'm also going to be talking in more detail about my experience integrating contemplative practice into 2 very large lecture courses. And so I'll very much be looking forward to your questions and comments. So between fall '03 and spring '11, I integrated contemplative practices into 10 courses with a total of 877 students. Individual course sizes ranged from 12 to 409 students. And during 2 of these years, I conducted the detailed human subject research I mentioned. I used a number of surveys, gathering both quantitative and qualitative data from first-year undergraduates on their experiences with contemplative pedagogy. These courses dealt specifically with art and religion, focusing on traditions where the visual arts are really intricately connected to religious practice. I gathered more subjective data in all of the other courses through surveys, informal surveys, including 2 large lecture courses on world art from 1500 to the present. In general, my students were not art majors or religious studies majors, but came from many disciplines within the arts, social science, liberal arts, social sciences, and the natural sciences, including business and engineering. It is notable how little actual data exists about student experiences, and this prompted me to undertake the research that forms the basis for this webinar. I hardly need to give a working definition of mindfulness to most members of the audience, but in case there are some of you who are unfamiliar with the term, I offer the following. In its most basic form, mindfulness means moment by moment present awareness, which is available to everyone regardless of religious or spiritual orientation. Fundamentally, I have sought to teach students a particular way of paying attention, 3 parts: on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. Like many of you, I believe that teaching students techniques of awareness, concentration, and means of disciplining their attention is absolutely essential in our era of fragmentation, ever-increasing speed, multitasking, and continuously interrupted attention. Introducing contemplative practices into the classroom results in new educational practices and pedagogies, and I'm just going to make a glance at that here. In my class, The Dialogue of Art and Religion, my students learn about Russian Orthodox icons, Himalayan Buddhist thangkas, and Navajo sand paintings through studying cultural and social history, religion, formal visual analysis, and creative processes. In addition, of course, to the mindfulness practices. And over the past decade, I've had a lot of feedback from those students, which is part of what prompted this research. As John Kabat-Zinn remarked during a lecture at the 2005 Columbia University Conference on Contemplative Practices in Education, most of us live most of the time in a narrow band of being where we are surrounded by I, me, and mine. We all know this. We suffer from this narrow focus. So the question is, how can we get more real? As teachers, how can we ignite passion in our students for this kind of presence, this being in their own lives? And this is precisely the work of contemplative pedagogy. It is about waking up and being present in our lives here and now. Tiny bit about my background. Beth has already mentioned several things. After many years of teaching a diverse array of courses in the visual arts, religious studies, and women's studies, I finally established a much closer relationship between my own values and pedagogy. My engagement with these issues has resulted in publication of 8 articles about pedagogy, and later this year, a long version of this research that I'm presenting today will be published in Buddhist-Christian Studies. Since spring 2008, I've co-led 3 colloquia with philosopher Michael E. Zimmerman, another Contemplative Mind Fellow here at the University of Colorado-Boulder, on the rationale, efficacy, and means of incorporating mindfulness practices into the classroom. My own artistic practice is increasingly contemplative. And Beth already mentioned that I have decades of experience as a yoga and Buddhist practitioner. In my courses, I have repeatedly chosen not to focus on or to describe my own background and experience, but to introduce my interest in contemplative inquiry by acknowledging research that I and others have done about teaching and learning. I will have more to say about this later in discussing the challenges of teaching contemplative practices. I'm going to be showing you a series of slides, simply the forms and surveys that I used. Prior to experiences in 2009, I had neither conducted human subject research, nor had I analyzed quantitative research data. I had no idea how complicated the approval and reporting processes would be for this research. 2 undergraduates who had studied with me, Katie Irvin and Mindy Bridges, helped to analyze the quantitative data and select the most pertinent qualitative narratives from some of the students. Besides the informed consent that you've just seen, I used a variety of assessment strategies: pre and post surveys, midterm evaluation, end of term self-assessment, a survey on life values, and 4 other anonymous surveys that had been developed by other researchers. Together, these surveys provided much useful data. I've made slides of them in order to give a sense of what they were, but I'll go through them briskly. I have electronic versions and would be happy to email these to anyone interested. My email will be at the end of the webinar. So pre and post surveys were questions that I simply put together, asking the students, what is contemplative art, or what is your prior experience? Before we did the class. At the end, what happened? How did mindfulness activities aid their learning? The life values survey showed surprising results. Contrary to my expectations, students reported top values as family relationships and wisdom, while they tended not to be concerned with values such as power, prestige, wealth, and where they live. In our highly materialist culture, consumer culture for that matter, I found this notable and possibly a reflection of the fact that young students are not yet part of the adult world, where making a living and possibly supporting others is so crucial. The lifestyle profile, of which you're seeing one of 2 pages, contains 52 questions about all aspects of daily life. The Freiburg Mindfulness Scale presents 14 statements that requires stating the frequency of various experiences related to mindfulness. The Mindfulness Attention and Awareness Scale contains 15 questions about everyday experience. And the Perceived Stress Scale asks 10 questions about the individual's stress level during the previous month. This scale is the most widely used psychological instrument for measuring the perception of stress. The analysis of the 4 major questionnaires produced inconclusive results. This slide includes just one of the charts showing statistical data that Katie Urban created. The data shows changes in student scores on all of the surveys from the beginning of the semester to the end after exposure to mindfulness in the classroom, with very, very rare exceptions. Number 555 in the perceived stress scale, you see, had exactly the same scores, but that was a real anomaly. As shown in this chart, some students' perceptions of stress increased while others decreased over the course of the semester. Even though the second evaluation was conducted near finals and the stress level of the students may have been higher than normal, many of them still showed a decrease in stress throughout the semester. The data shows that as mindfulness attitudes increase, stress decreases. In the classroom, mindfulness seems to have had an effect on the daily attitudes of students, as well as providing them with better stress management skills. But just a few more words about these inconclusive results. Although the data did not show significant statistical change throughout the semester, this may be due to other factors rather than a lack of significant trend. For instance, the sample size, 43 students, was very small, making it nearly impossible to show an obvious and significant trend. A few students from my classes chose not to participate. The sample size had to be reduced further because, to preserve anonymity, we had asked the students to invent a code name they would remember. Unfortunately, some of them could not recall their code name when it came time for the post-tests, so no comparisons could be made. Ideally, the study would need to be performed with many more participants. Many of the students in the course indicated that they had registered for it because of a pre-existing interest in pursuing mindfulness or because of what they learned at the outset, that first day of class. For these students, mindfulness pursued in the classroom may not have made a significant difference. To resolve this issue, and this is an obvious point, it would have been wise to include a control course sample from students who had neither previously received mindfulness training nor expressed any interest in it. Then the difference between the pre and post tests might have been more significant. Well, during the course of my teaching since 2003, I've experimented with introducing students to 13 forms of contemplative practice listed here. I'm going to talk a little bit more about those that are in black, the bow, sound meditation, etc. So, introducing the bow. In both large and small classes, I introduced this practice before making any other comments on the first day of class. I would ask all of the students to sit up straight, place their hands on their knees, both feet on the floor, maybe you're doing this with me right now, and to soften their gaze toward the center of the room. Arranging the classroom in a circle obviously makes this exercise more meaningful, but it is possible to do it in a lecture-style classroom as well. After everyone had stopped moving, I would simply bow my head and ask them to do the same. And then I would talk about what this means in 2 ways. Starting that first day, I invited the students to be fully present in class and to cultivate an attitude of respect for others and for the material that we would be studying. We would end the class with the same gesture of the bow. Over time, this collective bow became a profound symbol of presence and respect in the classroom. I also experimented with ringing a small gong and offering students in the small classes the chance to ring the gong as well. And students tended to arrive in class on time because they did not want to miss the bow or the opportunity to ring the gong. So experiences with and feedback from students in these small undergraduate classes was the basis of my decision to introduce the bow in 2 large 400-student lecture courses concerning world art. On the first day of class, for instance, in spring 2011, I asked students if they were interested in experimenting with the lecture format of our class. You can imagine the answer. A resounding yes. I explained what the bow is, why I teach it. I began by reminding students that nearly all cultures have a form of greeting, from formal bows in China and Japan to the familiar namaste in India, as well as various forms of handshakes, hugs, and kisses. I told them that for the last 8 years in smaller classes, I regularly taught techniques of mindfulness meditation as an aid to learning and building community in a class. And the bow is one of those techniques that students have told me was the most significant practice we did together. So to bow at the outset of a class, I told my big lecture group, means I have arrived. No matter what else I was doing, I'm here now with respect for myself, for all the others in the room, for the material we will study and look at today. So on the first day of class, after all students arrived, and after that initial bow, I would tell them what we were doing, studying world art, show them a keynote presentation about the art, and included what the experimentation we would do with contemplative practice and more. At the end of that first lecture, I gave them this prompt and had all students write their answers to the question. After collating the results, I presented their feedback in the following class session using visual word clouds or tag clouds that show the distribution of responses. And you can see it's very clear they're interested in visual culture, cultures around the world. They want to inspire their own art. They were, however, a significant subgroup of them interested in the potential for meditation practices. And that was clear from that first and second day of class. I asked the students about midway through the semester what had been the effect of our first practice, the bow. And this was actually after I had done other practices with them, beholding practice, breathing practice, some eye exercises and other things. Their answers are here for you to see, obviously, that this unified their attention, created a boundary from where they were before, gave them a focus, created a sense of respect. A few people said no particular effect. And then, as you can see on the left center of the screen, there's a little tiny word, it says dislike. And this data is reflected in this other screen. 77% wanted to continue the bow as a way of arriving in class. They said that it focused their attention upon arrival and helped them prepare the class as a whole, to prepare the class as a whole to focus, that it unified the class, that it allowed for slowing down, it added calm in busy days. Some said it cleared the mind and therefore created that boundary with the rest from the rest of the day. I collated all of these myself, all 400 index cards, because I really wanted to read them. 17% were indifferent or said it had no particular effect. And 6% actively disliked the bow for diverse reasons, because they thought it reflected my idealism, not their needs, because it seemed too religious or spiritual in a secular university, because they felt scattered and unfocused, because it felt forced or contrived, because they felt too self-conscious, and because they simply didn't understand this experiment. Now, I couldn't control the attendance for this class, so who knows how many students might have mentioned that last comment, that they didn't understand it, because they weren't there for the multiple times that I talked about what we were doing. At the very end of the class, in this fifth and final ink shedding, or I would ask them to shed a little ink for me, it's sometimes called a 1-minute paper, I asked students what had been the greatest value of the class. And It's very clear what they thought: expanding knowledge of art, learning about cultures around the world, a wider view of the world, and a very small group of those who answered this question said meditation. And then a similar group, as you can see by the size of the same color print, said they didn't gain much, which was a little disheartening. But I have since had some interpersonal interaction with students who were in those two large lecture courses. And maybe the ones who come to see me or greet me in the hall are the ones who appreciated the work. Well, I believe that highlighting students' voices is very crucial here, and therefore I want to offer the following examples of narrative student responses about specific practices that I had introduced. Alex wrote vividly about several aspects of contemplative practice, including breath work, working with thoughts, and the art project. By practicing breathing, he said, we can teach ourselves to be mindful. As I was reading Thich Nhat Hanh, I also started to pay attention to my breathing and was mindful of the fact that I was living and breathing while reading at the same time. Lindsay focused on meditation with sound. I was able to block out other distractions. The gong took over the thoughts racing in my mind and also other sounds outside in the classroom. It caused me to relax completely and forget about everything else. Very effective. I've noticed this reaction I have with music and sound before today. When I listen to music or go to concerts, the sound completely envelops me and I don't think about anything else. Jackie experimented with bringing mindfulness to daily activities such as cleaning her room. Today I followed Han's words, she wrote, and moved at a considerably slower pace. I took time to notice what I was putting away and the exact spot I would return it to. It may have been annoying at first, but in the end it was very beneficial. I felt completely aware of my surroundings in my room, which changed my mind, and I decided I would definitely try this again. Corey, trained as a singer before beginning college, wrote about working with the breath. I really connected with Han's emphasis on the importance of breathing. As a singer, proper breathing is a key concept. You need to breathe deep and let your diaphragm expand. This exercise really brought home to me how quiet and peaceful it can be to sit with people in silence, simply breathing. We are so accustomed to all of the chatter around us, it felt really unified to sit in companionable meditative silence. We received an enormous amount of anonymous feedback about mindfulness itself, which demonstrated an impressive understanding of the concept and practice. I've gathered many responses, just a couple. Mindfulness practice as a whole has made a massive difference in how I look at everything in my life. Studying, skateboarding, photographing, and listening to music can all be changed by how aware and mindful you are of the present situation. After practicing mindfulness this semester, said another student, I have become more calm and relaxed in most situations, and I'm able to enjoy life more because I appreciate the present moment. I feel overall happier with myself and those around me. Another student said, well, at first I remained very obstinate and closed-minded. With more experience, I became very open to the meditative effects. I felt at ease and at peace in moments that I typically just blazed through. It made trivial matters seem unimportant and allowed me moments of peace to regain control in such a world as ours, motivated by and driven by chaos. More than 2 years after they took my class, these and other effects were mentioned by 5 students of diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds. I solicited participation from approximately 40 students, gathered 8 of them subsequently for a lunch, and asked them to respond with to some of my questions. Lauren wrote that the class was the first exposure I had to mindfulness. It seemed strange and unfamiliar. Now I'm really interested in Eastern religions. I found the blue pearl. The ability to draw inwards and be peaceful shows as a concentrated light, blue light, in my brain. We came to respect each other and become a community. My colleague, by the way, Lorelei Bernacki, wrote to me recently that Swami Muktananda had used this image of the blue pearl. And although I'm out of touch with Lauren right now, so I can't ask her whether that image just came to her or whether she had by that time read some of Swami Muktananda or his followers. I'm not sure where the image came from. Anu, who was studying to be an engineer, remarked in his writing, "I'm afraid to fly. And whenever there was turbulence in Asia, I just concentrated on my breathing and it relaxed me. I thought back to this class. I've never done something so creative." B, a physics major, told us that, "I always tell myself to stay positive. It really de-stresses me. I wish we bowed in every class I had. I thought it was weird, but I really liked it by the end of the semester." All of these students communicated to me that actually practicing mindfulness, both in and outside of class, was more effective than simply reading about it. And such feedback is consistent with the emphasis in contemplative pedagogies on active embodied learning. So based on some of the artistic traditions we study, I usually offered students the opportunity to undertake a creative project. Several times I invited artist and teacher Cynthia Moku, an internationally renowned Thangka painter, to introduce Buddhist Thangkas and their historical traditions. She demonstrated traditional tigse, the proportional diagrams that form the basis for Thangkas, including these two drawings that are paintings actually now. So subsequently, students experimented with creating a Buddha or a Tara face or other simple diagrams. Some went on to create a work of art based on this practice, while others turned to other cultural traditions, such as Russian Orthodox icons or Navajo sand paintings. Due at the end of the semester, along with a short essay describing the work's history, context, ritual use, iconography, the role of the artist and viewer, and the wider function of art within that culture. These projects were then presented in class. Creating their own works of art based on a specific icon, Thangka, or sand painting thus combined creative exploration with studying a particular image in depth. These are just a few of the examples of the student work. In the interest of time, I'll just scroll through them somewhat quickly. This last one is a sand painting done by a young man named, I didn't tell you the names of the others actually, but Silas Howard. It was adapted from a shooting way chant within the Navajo tradition. So there were many challenges in introducing contemplative practices into the classroom. The first of these concerns the professor's experience or lack of experience in mindfulness and contemplative practice. On the one hand, as I noted earlier, I've been reluctant to share with students my own extensive experience over decades with practices such as yoga asana and pranayama, zazen, vipassana meditation, and more recent Vajrayana Buddhist practices. I've wanted them to approach contemplative practice with an open mind and not to be concerned about pleasing or trying to imitate me. I do not want to shape their experiences and expectations based on my own life choices. Yet if students ask, I always answer honestly about my own circuitous path of exploration. For instance, when we would talk about Vajrayana, about the Thangkas, which come out of a Vajrayana Buddhist tradition, and they would say, well, what does this mean, visualization? And they would say, how do you know this? Obviously, I would speak a little bit more about my experience. So, on the other hand, I'm greatly concerned when I hear of teachers or professors who have learned about contemplative practice through reading and then began to so-called teach such practices. It may be tempting to think that one can learn alongside one's students, but I believe this reflects a naive understanding of both the power and dangers of engaging students with this kind of inner work. So I recommend to anyone interested in teaching mindfulness practice that they first learn for themselves, and the Center for Contemplative Mind has been masterful at creating opportunities for that. A second, more minor challenge concerns finding adequate space for contemplative practice, especially if it is to involve sitting meditation and physical postures in a setting with minimal distractions. Students have complained that there were often too many distractions in the large classroom, and one student epitomized this shared complaint. I didn't like doing these practices in the classroom because there were too many distractions and I could never feel completely comfortable. Even though I would encourage novice students to embrace those distractions as part of the experience, it seemed inevitable that some students were simply going to resist and feel annoyed, no matter what I would suggest. So the physical space and furniture similarly can have a positive or negative impact on students' willingness to experiment. As I began exploring contemplative practice in the classroom, I was directing an undergraduate program in visual and performing arts, and I was able to purchase yoga mats, zafus and zabutons, meditation cushions, and store them in a small room adjacent to the main classroom where I was teaching. That small room was also conducive to practice, and students really liked that. A third challenge concerns institutional resistance, and I have to say that that figures fairly large on my own campus. As one of our administrative deans once put it, the litmus test for those of us at secular universities such as UC Boulder is, what will it look like on the front page of the Rocky Mountain News or the Denver Post? Unless they have direct experience with meditation and prayer, I have found colleagues and administrators to be mostly conservative about incorporating meditation into the classroom. I believe that this attitude may be changing, especially as research such as that of Richard Davidson and his colleagues at the University of Wisconsin, or of Harold Roth and his colleagues at Brown University becomes more widely known. The fourth major challenge is the student resistance I've already been talking about. It takes various forms: self-consciousness, thinking they already know it all, unfamiliarity, fear that they are doing it wrong, or thinking that the practices are cultish. I always have tried to meet such attitudes with an invitation to students to be curious, to embrace new ideas, and see what they could learn from their own experience. I just have two other major slides. Related to this fourth issue, my research produced a few negative results. Students have communicated a range of responses about what does not work for them. For instance, as I've already implied, some students felt that the practices were irrelevant and they could not find a connection to the material we were studying in class. One student said, "I just felt uncomfortable at times when we would engage in the practices because I couldn't see the relevance and it wasn't working." I assumed that this student had very high expectations and wanted to see immediate and tangible results of these simple contemplative practices. Others similarly complained that they had no sense of the practices working. I would talk with them about the fact that the ability to concentrate and pay attention to these senses, emotions, and activity of mind takes time, but some students were impatient and wanted immediate gratification. A few students were uncomfortable exploring something so new, although this negative reaction was overshadowed by the enthusiasm of the majority. Only a few first-year students in my smaller classes resisted our experimentation, while more than 20% in the larger classes were indifferent or negative about the experience. So although it was not in itself a negative result, the small sample size of the quantitative study and the fact that there was no control group make it very difficult to claim significant research outcomes. I have limited knowledge about how this research may have affected students' overall academic performance over the years of their undergraduate education because my study of their experiences was conducted over such short periods. So while it would be too simplistic to claim significant positive results, qualitative materials from students suggest that these individuals were profoundly affected by their classroom experiences with me. In their book, Cultivating the Spirit, researchers Alexander Aston, Helen Aston, and Jennifer Lindholm discuss the importance of contemplative practices for the academic, vocational, and spiritual development of undergraduates. Although the sample in my formal research study obviously differed greatly from their multi-year study with over 14,000 students at 136 colleges and universities. I certainly had substantive qualitative feedback over nearly 10 years that is consistent with the results of their research. A few students have told me over these years that our class encouraged them to become more actively engaged in the spiritual quest. Students repeatedly wrote that they experienced increased empathy and a sense of community in the classroom, as well as qualities such as patience and compassion toward themselves and others. They reported that they gained new ways of managing stress and anxiety. They learned at least a little about how to cultivate positive mental states in the context of stressful lives. Many students claimed that they experienced an increased sense of creativity, which undoubtedly had to do with the art project and the way we approached that. And finally, pertinent to the focus of the research, they deepened their understanding of mindfulness itself. So with that, I'm very, very interested in and open to your questions and or responses. I put a very small sample of some of the resources that I used on the screen, and my email is at the bottom. So I believe it's your turn.
Thank you so much, Deborah. Wow, you learned so many things designing that research, and though you say that the quantitative ones are inconclusive, I think it's interesting primarily as an artist and a teacher doing research. There's also the issue of you not being a neutral observer and having the strong interest in their learning and in building community, and for you to do a control group or randomized, that way you wouldn't be able to bring this to everybody, and I can see that your intention was really to make this available to anyone who would benefit from it. So
thank you. That's a generous and it's true. It's really
it
true.
is. It is.
Yeah, thank you.
And also the interpretation of the, with what you got from the narratives or the ink shedding, you just see how valuable that is for showing effects. It's always a question, what are the effects on students? And I think that way that you brought the students in too, and you reflected back to them what they as a group were experiencing, kind of makes them co-researchers or co-experimenters.
Yes, and I'm actually very committed to that. I learned that a long time ago, that when I'd seek feedback from students, whether it was the big formal midterm evaluation or a short 1-minute paper or ink shedding, I would always come back to the next class meeting with notes in hand and say, this is what you told me. And that, regardless of class size, I found that to be enormously generative of a positive sense of positive atmosphere.
Yeah.
A sense that I'm listening and very interested in their communication with me.
Yeah, that just their response and their interest in experimenting with the structure of class. You can see that you've got some ready and willing participants there. So I want to let you look at the questions now, Deborah. I'm going to try making you the organizer so you can look at the question pane. And if that doesn't work, I'll read the questions for you. But
Thank you.
So perhaps now your control panel will also show the questions.
I do see them. Thank you.
Great. Take a moment.
When McDonald asks, is it possible to have the slides emailed to us? Beth, this is a question for you. Will a podcast be available for people?
Well, we're recording this webinar, and so the PowerPoint slides are actually the view, what you would view as the little video that we produce, and then you'll hear Deborah speaking over the slides. So the slides are available in that kind of a package.
And Wendy, if what you're interested in would be, for instance, the surveys and the forms that I showed you so quickly, please email me directly, and I've got an electronic version of those, and I'd be most happy to send it to you. And then there's Jenna Rosales says, very inspiring, thank you. I would love to work this into the large engineering classes that I teach, but continue to be wary about how to frame it in this discipline. I also have taught in religious studies where it's an easier sell. Yes. Do you have any advice? Wow. I have the interesting experience right now this semester of going into some engineering classes because I work for our Faculty Teaching Excellence Program, and I've been there to conduct interview processes with students, with the professor not in the room, and I find them very, of course, very different. I would say if you have experiences, that would be a very important part of this, what your experiences are. If you have experiences with simple breath meditation, for example, and you wanted to open a class with that simply as a way to allow students to arrive. I've used this image of arriving a lot as I've taught these practices, that students have such busy lives, and they're running across the campus and racing into class, and they're trying to text while they run, and the whole, it. So my advice would be start with what you know. It's very simple, and that would help them actually arrive. So the fact that you teach professionalism, communication, and ethics in engineering seems to me that would be a very good context. Ethics particularly. What kind of respect do they have for one another and for the content when they walk in the room? Well, I was talking about how the bow as a practice, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that unless you had your own direct experience practicing this, but even just to say to a class when they come together, we are studying communication and ethics within the larger discipline in engineering. And I'd like you just to reflect for a few moments, breathe deeply, reflect about what quality of respect you are bringing into the classroom. So that would be a very immediate suggestion.
Wonderful.
John Brammer asks, since the quantitative results were somewhat inconclusive, what are your thoughts on how to refine that part of the information collection? Well, Beth alluded to that in her comments. I think if I were to do this over again, I might do it with a large class of 400 students, and I would do it. I mean, I've taught these practices for 10 years. Actually, this semester brings it to 10 full years. But I didn't do the explicit research with all of those classes. I would simply gather qualitative data, and you should see my bookshelves in my office. There's papers. And then a randomized study, a control group, doing something like the Aston Lindholm study required, that was a massive, I don't know if it was NSF funded, who funded it, I don't remember, but that kind of study, their book describes in great detail how they did the information collection. So,
yeah,
in a certain way, I don't mind that the quantitative results were inconclusive simply because it was such a small study. Beth, I think you're trying to get in.
Oh, no, just to say that, we're at a moment where, many people have been exploring these ideas independently and coming up with, you, out of just wanting to know what the effect was on your students, designed a research project. But, it's a widely held question, what really are the effects for students, and how do we get that information. And so I think things are sparking up some ideas of collaborations and, having some people who really are experienced in designing these instruments, developing something that could be more widely used. It's a ripe moment for going forward with an idea like that, on a large scale.
Yes. Beth, there are a lot more questions.
Yes.
Can I go on?
Yes, please go on. We have some time, so that's what this is for. Yes.
Karina Mrakovic asks, any ideas for introducing mindfulness to military academy college students in a science course? And I don't remember the name of the person who is taught, but Beth, you might remember.
Oh, yeah.
In
Marilyn Nelson. Yeah, she.
Marilyn Nelson.
Part of her fellowship. Yeah.
Yeah, I would really recommend that you contact her. I don't really think, you know, military training involves also many ethical questions and communication issues. And I think how you could potentially, as I was saying earlier, frame some of your introduction, if you really want to do this, in that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have some resources on the website from Marilyn Nelson, that Aborigine, what is Aborigine in the Citadel, I think is her article.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I mean, she offered it really for their own centering, you know, and taught them some practices, cadets who were about to be deployed. And so it had great value for them, I think,
Yeah.
having some
I valued reading
tools.
those too. I
Yeah.
just couldn't bring Marilyn's name to
Yeah.
mind. So James Rem asks, if you have taught the art and religion course without the mindfulness component in the past, can you comment on the difference, if any, in the understanding of the art students achieved with the mindfulness component included? That is a great question, but I have to say, unfortunately, I used the fellowship from the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society in 2002 to build a new course and to integrate contemplative practices all at the same time. Prior to that, I'd been teaching straight up art history. I'd been a department chair and a program director in women's studies, a department chair in art. And so those two things were coterminous. And so you ask in the second email or message, what were the pedagogical gains for art history per se rather than mindfulness per se? I worked with a colleague at Bowdoin. I don't know if Susan Wagner is still at Bowdoin, but we talked about teaching beholding practice to students. I mean, we even made a proposal to the College Art Association for a panel on mindfulness practices, and that was rejected some years ago. We didn't follow up. But I personally think that there are great gains, and my little TED cloud from the big art history class showed that students, they had an expanding understanding of art. Would they have had that if I didn't do the kind of practices I did? I don't know. Don't know for sure, but I'd like to think so.
Just those traditions the art, you know, coming from a Navajo or a Buddhist tradition, I would think that, you know, giving them a chance to understand that depth of experience, out of which that gives rise to the artistic process.
Yes.
You know, that whole contextualization and picture that you offered by, you know, even inviting them to participate in that process seems like it must enhance their understanding. Yeah.
Yeah. Vijisha Banerjee asks, could you go over the names of the scales or questionnaires again? I'm happy if you want to email me to send you these. The lifestyle profile, the Freiburg mindfulness scale, the mindfulness awareness and attention and awareness scale, and let's see, there was also the stress, sorry, I've got my papers, the perceived stress scale, and then a life values survey. So be happy to hear from you. In terms of your collected qualitative data, asks Aaron Godlowski, were there particular themes related to contemplative practice beyond those associated with art? In terms of your collected qualitative data? Well, yes, there were comments about test taking. Well, in fact, some of the narrative comments that I read, the way, you know, a student worked with her own practice of cleaning the room, the way another student listened to music, the way another student sang. Well, that's art, of course. The way a person took tests or I didn't read that one. One of the students said, I use my mindfulness practice taking a test. And it was an ardent comment. Without this, it was great. And his comment was very specific. He said, I wouldn't do as well on my tests right now if I didn't know mindfulness practices, how to be present. And he said he thought his memory was better, because he could call things up. And then another student flying was able to use, you know, the practice of, you know, simple breathing practice, observing sensation, those sorts of things. And Dadisha Banerjee also asked, have I looked at African and Islamic contemplative practice in the context of my class? There was one year that I did this. Actually, I'd have to say more the Islamic practices of prayer. And that was a really fascinating year. And my students, anyway, my students had a chance to learn probably more about Islam than they ever knew, along with the other traditions. That year I was also teaching about Haida Native American culture. And so the answer is yes. Did we do prostrations? No. Did I talk with them about what Islamic art and architecture shows about the practice? Yes. Or did we talk about the 5 main aspects of Islamic prayer and practice? Yes, we did. That was, yeah. And Kelly Clark, Beth, just interrupt me when.
Oh no, we're fine. I think, yeah, a few more. You have probably time for a couple more questions. So.
Okay. Kelly Clark Keefe asks, I would be interested in hearing more of your thoughts about the role of art making, poiesis, had or could have in your overall perspectives about mindful pedagogy. Okay, so I am a writer and an artist. Well, I was an artist first, then I became a writer. I have 2 new books coming out this year. I'm a little on the tired side. I'm just in a dormant phase, let's put it this way. My garden is dormant. My writing mind is dormant at the moment. So my art making and that right brain activity, which I love to engage in. I draw and I work in stone. I've had a drawing practice from college days. And so that's such a great question. It's certainly one of the impacts has been that I would bring the arts, the visual and music, performing arts too, performance arts, into all of my teaching. But then, of course, I am in art and art history, and I have taught courses, you know, my PhD is in religion, the study of religion and art history from Harvard, and I worked in both disciplines. I was always interested in integrations, possible integration. So my experience with my own creativity and following the twistings and turnings, and I used the word circuitous earlier to describe my spiritual path, but it's also, you know, learning to follow my own intuitive creative practice certainly has had an impact on how I encourage students to listen to themselves, to listen to their thoughts and insight and intuition and such. It is really a good question that I'd like to.
Such a beautiful invitation that you made to, I think you told me about those images, the paintings that they made, that those weren't studio art majors, and just that, you know, that creativity is something that any student can bring to their learning. You know, it doesn't have to just be in studio art, and just giving them that invitation.
Yeah.
Wonderful extension.
Yes.
Mindful pedagogy.
Yeah, the invitation to invite curiosity and to undertake this work with as an invitation is very important to me. This is a really great question from Anasi Baez. I want to bring mindfulness to my freshman year course. Any recommendations? Yes, I do have experience with mindfulness yoga and do have a Zen meditation practice. I think working with first-year students is really great. I love first-year, first-semester students. And I would urge you to get the Aston Lindholm book, first of all. And it's fairly new, and then my own article is with all the descriptions of my practices will come out later this year, as I mentioned, in Buddhist-Christian Studies. But there is a journal where I publish some of these it's a small journal that most people probably wouldn't know. It's called Arts, A-R-T-S, the Arts in Religious and Theological Studies. And honestly, if you want to write to me, I will send you the information for that. It's available via Atlas, ATLA, A-L-A-T-L-A serials. And you could see that today or tomorrow if you want.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's a wonderful offering, and you've just been so generous with the resources that you have here on the slide, and then also your making yourself available with your email address there so that people can follow up with you. One other way that I can manage the abundance of questions here is that we have a report that I'll send you with the questions and who asked them, and you know, if it's at all possible or you'd like to address some of them, we can make a provision for that, you know, in the future. But right now we're getting close to the end, so.
Could I give one more question?
Sure.
This comes from Tom Coburn, who has a venerable history with contemplative mind and with
Naropa, right?
Naropa. Do you want to comment on the fact that the discipline of religious studies has been more resistant to contemplative education for lots of complex historical reasons? People might like to know about Meditation in the Classroom by Judith Simmer Brown and Fran Grace. Yes, and you know, it's funny, I don't have that on my list. Do I? No, I have an article also in that book. You know, I have not taught directly, other than my graduate teaching fellow experience, in religious studies. But I think faculty there, my sense is that, especially in a secular university, faculty in religious studies have to be very careful about the perception that they are inculcating particular spiritual practices or a particular spiritual perspective, maybe Islamic prayer or Christian centering prayer or Buddhist shamatha meditation, or so I think that's, I understand that kind of care or caution that people, and there's a certain freedom that I've had because I'm actually, my appointments in departments since 1991 have been, other than that stint as director of women's studies, in art departments.
Yeah.
And so
It's true. Yeah, that is a great point. And that also that he brings that title, Meditation in the Classroom by Judith Simmer Brown. It is listed as a resource on our website, and it is wonderful for thinking about the question of, you know, when we're bringing these practices, we're bringing them with an intention to develop, you know, flourishing human beings, and not to create adherents of any particular religion or creed. So,
yes. Well, Beth, I would love to have, I see there are really still quite a few more questions.
Yeah,
I would love to have those if you have a chance to send them to me.
Oh, sure, no problem. It's easy to generate a report. And we've come to the end of the hour, so many thanks, Deborah. This was just, I'm so happy to be present for it and hear from you. And thank you so much to all of you who attended, too. The next webinar on our calendar is Wednesday, May 15th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, and we'll be with Ed Sareth, who is Professor of Jazz and Contemporary Improvisation at the University of Michigan School of Music, Theater, and Dance. We'll have registration up on the website soon, and we'll send that email announcement and invitation. So I hope many of you might be able to join us in May. We are working on a webinar for April, but it's inconclusive yet, so to be determined. But thanks again for everyone who joined, and farewell until we meet again. Bye, Deborah.
Bye.